So what we're planning on doing is this first webinar is going to be a bit of the basics, so give you an overview of the product and where we're headed with it, what you can do with it, and just a brief update. And we'll have some follow-on webinars in the coming weeks that will be on different topics and different specific use cases if you want to dig deeper into how to use a CSR for something very specific, and we'll go a little bit more technical and a little deeper on each of those webinars. So this session is really a kickoff for a series. So thanks again for joining. I hope you enjoy what you see here. And if you have any questions while we're going through the webinar, feel free to raise your hand, ask a question. We'll probably wait to take any of the questions over voice until the end of the webinar, but we have a couple of people as panelists on here from our team who will be able to answer some of the questions if you enter them through the Q&A system on the webinar. So we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I know usually a lot of them will pop up as we go along. Anyway, so let me jump forward here for a second. And if there's any problems seeing any of the slides or the audio has an issue or anything, feel free to raise your hand or ask a question and just speak up so we don't end up going a few minutes with nobody able to hear or anything like that. Hopefully everything will work properly and we'll have smooth sailing here. So let's move on to the first slide. So as I mentioned, actually before we go into the agenda today, I'll introduce myself. My name is James Schultz. I am one of the product managers on the CSR1000v product. And I have with me Esteban Torres, who's also another one of the product managers for the CSR1000v. And on the Q&A panel, looks like we have Devyani, who is another one of our colleagues, another one of the product managers on the product. So we've got a pretty good team to answer your questions here if anything comes up. I've been working on the product for a little over 2 years now. And I've been at Cisco for a number of years through a bunch of different product groups and seen a lot of different evolutions and changes in the way the network technologies have evolved and how Cisco has offered new product lines and addressed different markets. And the CSR, in my opinion, has been one of the most interesting things that I've worked on just because it's kind of a Swiss Army knife. It gives you a lot of interesting ways to do things in virtual environments in the cloud. We'll talk a little bit about that today. Anyway, here's the agenda for today. I mentioned it's going to be kind of a basic kickoff session. So first we'll talk a little bit about what the product is, where it came from, what some of the challenges are we're trying to address with the product. Second, we'll take a look at some of the specific use cases that we see users commonly using the CSR for. And again, we can go deeper into those in follow-on sessions if we want to take a real deep dive into any of these particular use cases. And since it is a pretty flexible product and it lets you do things in a lot of different ways in a lot of different environments with a lot of different features, as such, there's, of course, a flexible licensing model as well. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can best fit a CSR into your particular environment, your particular use cases, and your particular financial needs by selecting the right licensing and making sure you get everything deployed the way you want. Number 4, we'll talk about the recent releases. We've had a number of releases since the product was first posted to Cisco.com about 2 years ago. And we'll just talk about what the latest and greatest is. And then lastly, I'll leave you with some resources that I've put together that I think you'll find to be fairly handy if you want to learn more about the product, or if you're a tinkerer like myself and want to get hands-on with it in a very easy way and without spending any money. I'll give you some resources there as well so you can start playing around with the product without spending any money and without spending a whole lot of time on it. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. We'll start with the overview of the CSR, the product itself. And this slide doesn't really require a whole lot of explanation. It's probably self-explanatory for most people that look at it. The fact of the matter is the landscape of computing and networking has changed a lot in the last few years. We've gone from traditional networks and traditional servers and data centers into a world where things are rapidly becoming virtualized, and also beyond virtualization, a lot of businesses are moving into clouds. And the kind of in a nutshell here, virtualization gives you the ability to be a little bit more flexible with how you provision workloads and how you're able to balance workloads across servers, and gives you that sort of flexibility. But if you really, as a business, want to get into business models that rely on more or less infinite scalability, a lot of elasticity, very dynamic infrastructures, a lot of the cloud providers are giving you that sort of functionality. So as a customer of those cloud providers, you have a lot of choices. Do you purchase private cloud infrastructure where things are dedicated to you? Do you purchase public cloud infrastructure where it's a shared set of resources? Do you build your own private clouds? There's all sorts of questions as to how you go about tackling the different cloud environments and how they best fit your particular businesses. And a little bit of background both on the enterprise side of things and also on the service provider side of things, just to show where the markets are headed and why we felt there was a lot of demand for this sort of a product. Number one, enterprises. I mean, there's no denying that enterprises are rapidly adopting the cloud. If you look at the stats on the left, they come from the latest reports. Enterprises are basically doubling the amount of workloads that they're willing to put into public clouds on an annual basis. So it's the cloud infrastructures are really going through kind of a exponential growth phase where more and more enterprises are getting on the bandwagon and moving workloads into the cloud. And inevitably, I mean, it's not a simple journey to move your business into the cloud. There's a lot of challenges you see on the right-hand side. And first and foremost, it's usually security, performance, and cost. You know, can I meet all the security needs for all of the security advisors in my business? Can we hit all those check boxes? Will it perform the way we need it to? And can we actually have visibility into that performance? You know, where are performance problems happening? And third, is it actually going to save us any money, or is it going to end up costing us more? And then last of all, you know, you get all these benefits of the cloud and the simplicity and the elasticity that it brings, but you as a customer of the cloud might say, okay, well, to get where I need to go with you know, different networking technologies and different features in the cloud, maybe I have to pull in different pieces from different vendors or even multiple pieces from the same vendor and put them all together in what we call a solution stitching sort of environment. And that adds a whole lot of complexity to what should have been a simple solution. You know, that's the premise of the cloud, is making things simple for you, and just kind of turns it into a mess of virtual wires and virtual networks and all that sort of stuff. And that's best to be avoided if possible. So that was the enterprise side of everything. Service providers, on the flip side of all this, they have a huge opportunity to build clouds to deliver on this demand from enterprises. So a lot of the reports, the most recent research are showing that there's really about a 50% year-over-year growth rate for enterprise spending on the cloud. And this means something very big for a lot of cloud providers or even businesses that are starting up to try to be cloud providers, that in order to capture a lot of this business, you really have to figure out how to differentiate your cloud. You know, clouds used to be just a cheap way to get some compute and some storage and some memory with not a lot of bells and whistles. And you know, if you stick to that sort of a model, you risk becoming sort of a commodity. And being able to put in additional features that enterprise users want into your cloud, offering those as additional value-add services, those are ways you can differentiate your particular cloud offering as a cloud provider, and hope to draw in some of this growth rate and all the dollars that are associated with it. So we're hoping that on both sides of the story, we can help enterprises meet their needs when they're moving to the cloud, and we can help service providers grow and offer new offerings that are attractive to their customers using the CSR product. So in a nutshell, I mentioned a little bit about what clouds used to be like. It was just a very simple, cheap way to get storage and compute and memory. And things have evolved a bit since then. So now you have clouds that are having to react to customers that are asking for more of the traditional stuff that they have in their enterprise network. So if they want to get intrusion detection, or they want to get advanced firewalling, or network inspection, or advanced VPN types, all of these different pieces of flexible network infrastructure that they had in their enterprise networks, they're starting to go to the cloud providers and say, hey, okay, you know, we've kind of proven the point that we can run workloads there, we can run our applications there, you know, bandwidth is fine, everything runs fine, but now we need a little bit more flexibility, kind of like we used to have in our networks that were under our control, rather than just moving into something that kind of simplifies the way of doing things but doesn't give them all of the features that they're used to and that they want. So that's the big challenge that cloud providers are dealing with right now. And the CSR fits in a kind of a unique way that we'll take a look at as we get further in the presentation here. So I know you're probably wondering, when we're going to start talking about the CSR here, since this is, after all, a CSR webinar. So we'll take a look here. These are the challenges that we originally built the CSR product to address. We had a lot of customers that were coming to us saying, hey, we have enterprise infrastructures built out. We're moving to the cloud. These are some of the problems that we're running into. What can you do to help us? So in a nutshell, on the bottom, I'm not going to read all the bullet points to you, but from a security and integration perspective, you as an enterprise have IT people working for you and engineers working for you that understand how to build networks. They know how to use iOS. They know how to build firewall policies and VPN policies, and they know how to do monitoring and troubleshooting, and all those standard things that happen in day-to-day operations. And when they move to the cloud, all that stuff changes. So every single cloud that you might sign up with, whether it's Amazon or Rackspace or SoftLayer or Azure, or any of the different clouds that are out there, or even if you build your own clouds, they all have different tool sets that they give you in terms of doing a lot of that configuration and monitoring. They might have different little nitty-gritty features in the way the firewall works or the way the VPN works and different ways to set it up. So it's all very unfamiliar, and it may or may not have exactly the bells and whistles and features that you want, essentially, to be able to migrate to the cloud. Same with IP addressing. Do they give you public addressing? Do they give you the ability to bring your own private address scheme? Do they require you to do NAT? It's a million different ways to do it in different clouds, depending on who you choose. And from a user experience perspective on the right-hand side there, the way we saw a lot of businesses adopting the cloud was they would actually just take their existing enterprise infrastructure, which would involve a bunch of branch locations that you see there, with some sort of link back to their enterprise data center or their headquarters, whether it's a private WAN link or a VPN link that's been set up. And they would just tie the data center or the headquarters into the cloud and use it as kind of an aggregation point. All the branches would come into the data center or come into the enterprise headquarters, and then from there they would hop over to the cloud. And there's some pros to that. I mean, it gives you the ability to use all of your existing assets for security and VPN and everything in your enterprise data center to operate on that traffic before it goes in and out of the cloud and make sure it's secure. But it also introduces a lot of unnecessary latency and hops, because if you have all these branches all over the world and they all have to come back through your enterprise data center to get to the cloud, it seems like it would make a whole lot more sense to just have them go directly to the cloud, take the best path across the internet, and get there with the least amount of latency so that you can have a good user experience on the applications that you're running in the cloud. So same picture here, but now we have the CSR in the mix. And again, I'm not going to read all the bullet points to you, but in a nutshell, what we've done is we've taken the CSR and given you the ability to essentially bring your own network into the cloud. So if you're already used to iOS-based products, you're building VPN policies and firewall policies, and you have all that stuff baked and working just fine in your enterprise network, you can just basically bring a CSR into any cloud that it's supported on or any virtual environment that it's supported on and have all that same functionality and just extend your existing policies directly into the cloud. Treat it essentially as another location in your enterprise network. And along with that, since you're bringing an iOS-based product into the cloud, generally you're going to get a lot more features and functionality in the CSR than you would from what the cloud provider itself would be giving you. So for example, different VPN types. Maybe the cloud only gives you IPsec VPN, but you want to use DMVPN or FlexVPN or any of the other different types of VPN that are available in iOS. The CSR gives you that flexibility. And that sort of story pretty much holds true across the board in all different range of networking features. So we've talked a little bit about what the CSR does, but what exactly is it? So here's a little bit of detail that we'll dig into just to give you an idea of what it really is. Starting at the top there, I mentioned iOS. It's running the iOS XE software. And if you haven't heard of iOS XE before, it's exactly the same software that runs on a few of our hardware platforms, namely the ASR1000 series and also the ISR 4400 series. Both of those are two of our latest and greatest hardware platforms that run iOS XE. And the way this is all actually structured is it's the same code base. So if we build a new feature into one of the hardware platforms like the ASR or the ISR, it automatically ends up in the CSR as well, since we're all sharing the same code base. you can almost think of the CSR as just another platform for that same piece of software. So we've essentially got the iOS XE software with hardware platforms and software platforms now, all running the same releases, same release cycle, same bug fixes, same features as they get developed. So it's really not a one-off product that you're going to have to worry about having its own development cycles and its own bugs. It's all tied together with the rest of the iOS ecosystem, so you know it's going to have the latest and greatest development work put into it. It's also as infrastructure agnostic as we could make it. There are some other 1000v named products at Cisco that traditionally have been very tied into specific hypervisors, for example. And I know there's been pros and cons to that, and we tried to avoid any of that sort of lock-in from the get-go. So the CSR itself, you can see here, basically runs on top of any hypervisor, any major hypervisor that's out there today, and any of the virtual switches that are available on those. So for example, we launched the product originally on VMware ESXi, and then very rapidly added in support for KVM, Xen, and now we have Microsoft Hyper-V. So that addresses all of the major hypervisors that anybody is typically going to be using in a production environment. And along with those, the virtual switches, so whether you're using the built-in virtual switch on any of these hypervisors, or if you're using the distributed virtual switch from VMware, or you're using the Nexus 1000v, or anything else, it all just works fine with the CSR1000v, since we just need the virtual interfaces from that virtual switch. There's no real glue or tie into the layer 2 fabric, since we're operating above layer 2. And deeper down in the stack, the servers, again, it'll run on any x86-based server as long as it meets the minimum requirements of CPU generations from Intel and memory requirements and that sort of thing. Obviously, it's not going to run on a 386 or something, so you have to abide by the minimum requirements, and then everything is essentially supported. And one other important thing to note, if you look at the very bottom right hand of this slide, one thing that we added into the CSR1000v that didn't exist on the hardware platforms for iOS XE is a REST API. The reason being that the CSR was, from the get-go, we knew it was going to be deployed into dynamic environments, whether it's a virtual environment or a cloud environment, where orchestration tools are being used to spin up and down different pods of infrastructure or make changes to the infrastructure. And this REST API now allows those same tools to dig deeper and actually go into the CSR once it's provisioned and build configurations for different networks and different networking features and services, along with that task of spinning up and down pods of infrastructure and everything like that. So we'll take a closer look at some of the use cases that we've seen a lot of users adopt the CSR for. And to start with the basics, really where we position the CSR in general, or where a lot of users are using the CSR, is as a WAN gateway in multi-tenant environments. So if you look at the picture here, just a brief rundown, the left-hand side you have Enterprise A, Enterprise B, so these are different customers or tenants of a cloud provider that you see on the right-hand side there. So they all have their own locations coming into the cloud over MPLS or over the internet or any other mechanism they might have deployed. Cloud provider gets that traffic coming in, and it obviously wants to keep that traffic private for that particular customer or tenant. So they have any set of infrastructure deployed inside the cloud environment to get that traffic into the customer's virtual private cloud that you see on the right-hand side there. So Enterprise A, they have physical locations all tied into their tenant A virtual private cloud on the right-hand side there, same with tenant B. And you'll see the CSR there sitting at the front end of each of those virtual private clouds. There's one in front of tenant A and one in front of tenant B. So essentially, it will get used as the IP default gateway for all the workloads in that particular tenant VPC or virtual private cloud. And by doing that, it gives you a lot of flexibility, either as an enterprise that's bringing this on your own or as a service provider that's offering the CSR as a part of that tenant's managed service offerings, in that you can then apply all sorts of different network services that are built into the CSR since the traffic is going through there as a default gateway. Basically, you have that traffic captive, you can run services on it, and you can add a lot of value to the traffic that's flowing through it. It also distributes the load, so as a service provider, if you traditionally wanted to offer a network service in a cloud environment, a lot of the approach has been to stick to the bigger, higher end network services appliances, deploy those physically underneath the cloud infrastructure, and then through your orchestration tools, configure those services to offer them to the different individual tenants. And the downside to that is you have all of these tenants hammering a particular appliance, and you may end up with resource contention. If you need to upgrade it, you got to figure out a strategy to do the forklift upgrade without impacting all of those tenants. So by having a CSR in each individual tenant VPC, each tenant now has their own set of performance resources available for running these network services. It's not going to impact anybody else. And if you need to upgrade to a new version of CSR or upgrade to a larger license on a CSR, you can do it for that particular tenant without impacting everybody else. Now that you have the CSR in place as the default gateway for a particular tenant, one of the particular use cases we see a lot of people use it for is a VPN gateway. So once you've got the CSR there, you can actually set up all your different enterprise locations to VPN into the CSR and provide secure access into the applications that you're running in the cloud. Some of the feedback that we've had is, a lot of the different cloud providers, almost universally, they give you some level of VPN functionality, whether it's Amazon or Rackspace or anybody else. But the three pieces of feedback that we've had across the board have been, the CSR is familiar, so it's a no-brainer for the IT departments to be able to set up VPN between their existing locations and the CSR. Usually there's some complication trying to figure out how to get VPN working with whatever the black box VPN solution is that most cloud providers give you, so the CSR is a lot more straightforward. B, once it's set up, and generally we've had a lot better uptime. With VPN tunnels connected to the CSR, there seems to be a lot of flappiness with the VPN solutions offered by certain cloud providers. The CSR gives you some reliability there, not having to worry about the VPN tunnels going up and down, and even worse, not having any visibility into figuring out why or troubleshooting it. And third, if you're doing a lot of VPN tunnels, like if you have a lot of retail locations, for example, that all need to connect into an application you're running in the cloud, there's usually some scalability limits that you run into with the different cloud providers. And even if you can get beyond the scalability limits, they usually end up charging you on a per tunnel, per hour sort of basis, and it ends up getting very expensive very rapidly. So CSR you can kind of think of as an all-you-can-eat VPN solution. You put the CSR in your virtual private cloud, and then we support today up to 400 VPN tunnels. We're expanding it to 1,000. And there's no additional per tunnel charge or per hour charge or anything like that. This VPN specific, you can just turn up as many locations as you want and not have to deal with the additional charges. Another thing that you can do with the CSR when it's sitting in front of your workloads is we call it traffic control and management. The idea here is there are other services that may not potentially be built directly into the CSR, but we give you a lot of tools in the CSR to get traffic over to those services. So the example that I have here is for WAS, and if you're not familiar with WAS, it's basically a way to optimize network traffic when it goes between locations, when you have WAN links with limited throughput and limited performance. So it will deduplicate traffic, it'll compress traffic, it understands different protocols for different applications, and will tweak those to reduce the amount of round trips, those sorts of things. So in the physical world, it's all been pretty straightforward for a number of years now, where you have essentially a WAS device deployed at each location that does this optimization, and then you have a router that the traffic normally would be flowing through as a default gateway in each of those locations, and then that router is responsible for identifying the traffic that needs to be optimized based on different classification rules, and sending that traffic to the WAS appliance so that it can be optimized. There's also a virtual WAS appliance that runs on different hypervisors, just like the CSR does. And since that redirection functionality is built into the iOS code base, it used to be WCCP. Now it's a feature called AppNav, which is kind of like an enhanced version of WCCP that gives you some additional flexibility. That's all in iOS, so now we have it on the CSR as well. So in the physical world, you have your physical router doing redirection to a physical WAS appliance, and in the virtual world, you have a CSR doing redirection to a virtual WAS appliance, and you basically get the same optimization infrastructure between physical locations and between physical and virtual locations, or even between virtual and virtual locations if you wanted to do that. And this holds true not just for WAS. That's just one very specific example. If you have some external virtual machine that you want to do intrusion detection on, or you want to do like a virtual NAM type solution for traffic inspection, the CSR is a great way, since the traffic's already flowing through it, to be able to build those policies to intercept traffic or redirect traffic or tunnel traffic, whatever you need to do with it to get the traffic to those different services. It's that control point where you have that level of control. And one other thing that we had a lot of requests for was using the CSR for either extending networks or providing mobility across networks. And I've tried to put together a little bit of a summary here for you without a lot of added complexity in the diagrams. There's really three different options we're talking about here. OTV is overlay transport virtualization, and it's a layer 2 extension protocol that's built into a lot of different Cisco products from across different product lines even. And it gives you the ability to take a layer 2 network and just extend it between locations. So you can actually take a workload, pick it up from one location, copy it, put it down on the other location. Don't even have to change the IP address of it or anything, because it's on the same layer 2 broadcast domain. Essentially, there's some inner workings that kind of adjust the way that actually works, but it does extend the layer 2 network between multiple locations, and that's built into the CSR along with a number of other Cisco products, so you can kind of pick and choose what platforms work best for you in different locations, whether it's a physical location, a virtual location, a cloud location, and make that layer 2 extension functionality work. Lisp, in the middle there, is a layer 3 mobility protocol. So if you have multiple locations that have different IP addressing schemes, and you still want to be able to move workloads around between those different locations, Lisp is a good bet there, because it lets you maintain your IP addresses and still have portability between locations, even if the subnets are different ranges. Then on the far right-hand side, there's a third option that's being built by a group at Cisco. It's actually the same group that makes the Nexus 1000v switch. It's called Intercloud Fabric. And Intercloud Fabric is essentially a package solution that they're offering that gives you a way to put a component in a cloud and then put a component in your enterprise data center. And it gives you an interface to turn up extensions for your enterprise VLANs or layer 2 networks over into the cloud. So if you have a VM running in your enterprise data center and it's connected to, let's just say 3 different virtual NICs on 3 different virtual layer 2 networks, with Intercloud, you can say, okay, I want to move this VM from my enterprise network into this particular cloud. It'll extend those 3 networks that are required for that VM over into the cloud transparently. You don't need to do anything for it. It'll do it all for you. And it'll even move the VM for you from your enterprise network into the cloud and do all the reconfiguration of the VM, reconfiguration of the virtual NICs and everything to make sure that it works properly on the cloud. They do this using some interesting technology they built for building a layer 2 overlay network on top of the cloud, so they can kind of work around any of the restrictions of you not being able to tinker with the layer 2 infrastructure on a cloud, since they do it in an overlay network. So if you have any interest in that sort of a solution, it's worth having a follow-up with the Intercloud team, and they can give you a brain dump on what the latest and greatest is with that functionality that they have built. And the CSR integrates with the Intercloud Fabric. That's why we have it listed on here, so we can actually act as a gateway in and out of that overlay network that I mentioned that they built. And one final solution that we're able to provide on the CSR is VXLAN. If you're not familiar with VXLAN, essentially it's you might be familiar with VLAN, so you have a way of isolating different network segments as they go across a larger network by tagging the packets when they're sent out on the wire with particular .1Q tags, or VLAN tags as a lot of people call them. But there's a limitation there. Those VLAN tags, it's a small tag essentially, and you can only do 4,094 VLANs. Otherwise, you just run out of a number of unique tags that you can have in your infrastructure. So this comes into play when you're a service provider and you're trying to build a large network that's going to service not only hundreds and not only thousands of different tenants, but getting into the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of tenants before you have to start replicating your pods of infrastructure, because that gets expensive if you have to start replicating all of your different pods of infrastructure for a small number of tenants rather than just adding more tenants to your existing infrastructure. So the picture basically shows here, as a service provider, if you're building this sort of an infrastructure, the left-hand side, the yellow, you have all these different WAN links coming in from all your different customers. And generally, those are coming into some set of aggregation routers. And those aggregation routers, their role is essentially to take those WAN links from different customers and map them into layer 2 segments that then get piped through to the different virtual private clouds for those particular tenants. So if you're using VLANs, for each customer that's coming in, you map them to a specific VLAN. And again, you only have around 4,000 of those that you can use. So right there, you're limited to 4,000 tenants on any given pod of infrastructure. And that's if you don't have any network services involved in that layer 2 infrastructure that I depicted as a cloud there. If you start putting things in between there for security services or anything else that requires VLAN stitching to hook those services together between the outside world and that tenant VPC, you might tie up 2, 3, 4, 5 different VLANs for one tenant just to stitch those services together. So in that particular case, you may actually end up with a pod of infrastructure that can only do a couple hundred tenants before you have to replicate it. VXLAN gets around this because it can do millions and millions of different isolated networks before you run out of tags, essentially. And the CSR understands VXLAN natively. We built it in there. So you can bring in many, many more tenants, aggregate them all onto the same layer 2 infrastructure using VXLAN, and each of the CSRs will be listening for that particular tenant's VXLAN traffic. And then internal to the VPC, when the tenant has their different applications provisioned in there as workloads, the CSR will translate that traffic into either untagged packets or VLAN tagged packets, whatever they choose. But in either case, it's something that's a lot more familiar for those applications to be able to talk to in those underlying operating systems without having to deal with having it talk directly to VXLAN. So those are most of the common use cases that we've seen customers asking for the CSR to fulfill. And licensing, again, is just as flexible as the use cases. So you can kind of tailor what license you buy to specifically what you're trying to do with the product. The way this diagram is drawn is start from the left and move your way to the right. So when you're buying a license for the CSR, the first thing you do is you pick which technology package you want. So you'll see there's 3 of them listed there. There's standard, there's advanced, and there's premium. And each of these has a subset of features built into it. So generally, depending on what use case you're going to use the CSR for, you'll look at the list of features and you see which one makes the most sense, and that's the one you buy the license for. And the next slide has a breakdown of exactly what is in each of these, so I can give you a little bit of an overview of why you would pick advanced versus standard or premium versus standard, for example. So once you've picked one of those, we offer a number of different throughput licenses. So if you just need a very specific feature but you're not expecting a lot of throughput, you could save a lot of money and just buy one of the low-end 10 megabit per second licenses. And then as you grow, you can buy higher levels of throughput. Or if you know right off the bat that you're going to be pushing a lot of throughput through the CSR, you can just go ahead and buy one of the higher throughput licenses in the 1 gig or 5 gig range. And once you pick the features and the performance you want, you just pick whether you want a 1-year license, you want a 3-year license, or do you want a license that never expires, a perpetual one. And once you've picked those 3 things, the technology package, the performance, and the duration of the license, you end up with one of the particular SKUs that you can find on our price lists. So the example you see on the right-hand side there is standard technology package, 250 megabits per second for a 1-year license. And if you looked into the price list for the CSR, that would be one of the options in there. So all of these combinations are available in the price list, and you can pretty much pick whichever one fits your needs most specifically. So here's the breakdown of the technology packages. You'll see it's pretty straightforward the way it's set up. Standard has all of your generic standard networking technologies that you would use for just general routing environments, some of the basic network services like DNS and DHCP, NAT, all those sorts of things. Advanced is where you start to get the security-based features. So you get all the different VPN types with the crypto involved. There's no crypto in standard, it's all in advanced. So if you're encrypting anything, automatically you'll look at advanced. And also the zone-based firewall. So if you really want the advanced firewall functionality, that's all in advanced. So think security when you're thinking of advanced. Premium starts to go more into very specific kind of niche use cases. So things like VXLAN that we talked about, or OTV or Lisp for doing network extension. When you're doing those sorts of very specific use cases, premium is where you would start to look. Now, beyond the standard licensing model that we just talked about, there are a few other options that are worth noting. A very important one you'll see on the left there is Cisco Smart Licensing. You may have heard of Smart Licensing, you may not have heard of it. It's a new initiative that's happening at Cisco. There's actually a fairly large BU that is just building Cisco Smart Licensing. And what it is it's a new method of licensing at Cisco that will eventually replace all of the old mechanisms. So the previous, the standard licensing that we just talked about is still based on pack codes. And if you're familiar with those, basically you buy a Cisco product, you buy a license for it, you get a pack code that's an electronic code, and then you go to Cisco.com, you activate the pack code with a unique identifier for your particular product, and then that product is licensed, and the license is tied to that particular physical or virtual product. Smart licensing, on the other hand, is a more flexible way of doing the licensing, where there's a license server hosted at Cisco, and when you purchase licenses as a Cisco customer, those licenses would automatically get loaded into your smart licensing server at Cisco. So you get these pools of licenses that you accumulate as you purchase licenses from Cisco. And when you turn on your products, whether it's a hardware product or a virtual product, they will call home to Cisco, to the Cisco Smart Licensing Service, and essentially check out a license to use as long as that product is up. If you turn the product off or it fails and you need to RMA it, the license will just get returned into your pool at Cisco. And then when you bring up a replacement or restart it, it'll just call back home again, check out the license again, and everything will go back to normal. So the CSR is actually one of the first products to support smart licensing. We are doing some early trials right now with customers that have asked us for this functionality, and everything's going pretty well. We're also in the process of building a utility billing model into smart licensing that will let you, instead of buying the licenses up front, you wouldn't buy anything up front, you would just pay per hour. So smart licensing in the utility model would just keep track of how many CSRs you're using, how many hours they're up, and generate a bill for you at the end of the month. So essentially this gives you the sort of financial model that you typically would only get with a public cloud with the hourly billing, and gives you that sort of flexibility in your own privately owned locations if you want to deploy CSRs in a dynamic fashion in your own environment, and you don't want to buy all the licenses up front. This is a good way to go about it. So you'll see that showing up very shortly. It's in development right now, and it'll be the next phase of smart licensing that we release. On the right-hand side, there's also, since the CSR is a virtual product, we have it launched in a lot of the public clouds that are available. So we're starting with Amazon. We launched the CSR in Amazon last November. And we started out with just a bring your own license model. So when you put it in Amazon, you had to buy a license from Cisco, install it on the CSR that's running in Amazon. And since then, we've enabled the hourly model in Amazon as well. So the AWS Marketplace gives you the option now. You can pick the bring your own version of the CSR, or you can pick the hourly version of the CSR. And when you do the hourly one, you just provision it. You don't pay anything up front. You just pay Amazon hourly as part of your monthly Amazon bill for the CSRs that you use. And then on the back end, they cut us a check every month for a portion of the revenues that are collected for CSR. So you don't pay anything direct to Cisco in that case. And then a very niche thing on the bottom there, we have a few specific licenses available for route reflectors. We've had a few customers that have asked us to use the CSR as a route reflector with these massive route tables that require a lot of memory, so we have a specific license available for the route reflector use case. So I promised you a little bit of an update on what the latest and greatest is. 3.12 is the latest release that you'll find on Cisco.com right now. 3.13 you'll see at the bottom, that's right around the corner. In the next couple of weeks it'll show up on Cisco.com. And you'll see an announcement and release notes and everything for 3.13, so you can find out what the latest and greatest is once that one gets posted. But it will have a bunch of new features. It will have a significant increase in performance. But for 3.12, which is the current release, give you a little bit of an update. We added support for 8 virtual CPUs. And for a little bit of background, when we launched the product originally a couple of years ago, we only supported a 4 virtual CPU form factor. It couldn't be any smaller, couldn't be any larger. And we had a lot of requests in both directions. So the first thing we tackled was making the CSR fit into smaller VMs so it's more efficient and doesn't cost you as much money to run. So we've offered all the way down to 1 virtual CPU for quite a while now. So you've been able to run smaller than 4 virtual CPUs. And then in the 3.12 release, we added, on the other side of the spectrum, you can now add 8 virtual CPUs if you wish to add more virtual CPUs than 4. Performance, we've actually come a long, long way. Just between the last 2 releases, between 3.11 and 3.12, we've upgraded from having 1 gigabit per second of performance on a single CSR instance up to 5 gigabits per second of performance on a single CSR instance. And again, for some background, when we first launched the product just a couple years ago, the highest level of throughput that we would license you for was 50 megabits per second. So just in a few releases, we've bumped the performance from 50 megabits per second up to 5 gigabits per second, and you're going to see an even higher number in 3.13. And there's just been a ton of engineering effort going into doing everything we can to tweak the network drivers, tweak the internal packet processing, and make sure that we can get every ounce of performance out of this thing that we can. So you get every ounce of performance out of every dollar you spend in the cloud with this solution. And we talked a little bit about Hyper-V. So that was the last of the major hypervisors that we needed to add support for. So now in the 3.12 release, Hyper-V is supported along with all of the previous version or previous hypervisors, so VMware ESXi, Zen, KVM, and now Hyper-V is all covered. Smart licensing, beta customers are now trying out the smart licensing service, and it'll be generally available in the next releases. And we talked about VXLAN. What we added in 3.12 now is kind of a multi-tenant version of VXLAN. So not only can the CSR talk natively to VXLAN on the network, it can actually take VXLANs and map them into specific VRFs. So if you have, let's say, 5 different users that are all connected into a CSR, and they all need to have their own isolated VXLAN networks, the CSR can provide a specific routing table, a VRF, for each individual customer and tie each of those routing tables into a specific VXLAN. So in essence, we'll operate as 5 separate individual routers all connecting into the VXLAN network. And we support up to 250 VRFs. So you have a good amount of flexibility in terms of doing sort of multi-tenant approaches using VXLAN and the CSR. The hourly billing that I talked about on AWS, on Amazon, that was just introduced in the 3.12 release. Prior to 3.12, we just had to bring your own license model in Amazon. And in 3.12, with every other release, we continually improve the REST API that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. I can't list out all the features here because it would take up the whole slide, but each release we keep enhancing the REST API, adding new features and functionality, and based on feedback from our customers. So that's essentially the latest and the greatest. Keep an eye out for 3.13 in a couple weeks when it gets posted. And what I'm going to leave you here towards the end with is I put together a couple different resources that I think would be handy if you want to learn a little bit more about the product. Maybe you know a lot about it, maybe you know a little bit about it, but there's a few different places here you can dig into more details. And also, as I mentioned, I like to tinker with things, and I like to set up labs and play with products and find out exactly what they can and can't do. And I'll give you some resources here that will give you an easy way to do that without having to build out your own lab infrastructure or buy anything. So to start with, the first place you should probably start is the product page for the CSR1000v. If you just go to cisco.com/go/cloudrouter, that'll take you to our homepage, and I'm sure the picture on the right is very familiar if you've ever been on cisco.com before. For any product, you get kind of all the standard literature. So if you want to look at the data sheets for the latest releases, if you want to look at case studies for how different customers are using this product, any of the Q&A that we update for every single release based on the new features, white papers, all that stuff is in there. So that's probably the first place to look if you want to start educating yourself about what the CSR can and can't do, what features are in it, how it's supposed to be used, all that sort of stuff. Next is a really interesting one. We have a test drive set up on Amazon Web Services. And what the test drive is it's kind of like a sandbox environment where you get a free set of resources for a given amount of time that's provided to you by Amazon and by Cisco. So you can go in, provision a demo environment with a CSR in it, log into it, play around with it, see what it does for a given amount of time, and it's totally free. You don't have to pay anything for it. So if you go to just csrtestdrive.com, it'll take you to this page. You just sign up for it, and it'll log you into Amazon Web Services, and you can log into the CSR and start tinkering around with it right away. So, I mean, literally after this meeting is over, you could go sign up for this and have a CSR in front of you to play around with in, I'd say, 5 minutes or less. It's really that painless. And if you want to play around with the CSR more long-term or actually do look into doing a production deployment on Amazon, it's really easy to find us in the Amazon Marketplace. You just go to aws.amazon.com/marketplace and just search for Cisco. We're the first group at Cisco to have anything in the marketplace, so for the time being, it's easy to just search for Cisco, and you'll see there's two options there for the CSR. There's the bring your own license version on top and the hourly version on the bottom. So depending on which one you want to try out, you can go ahead and click on one of those, and that's just a few more button clicks after that to accept the license and tell it which VPC you want it in and IP addressing and that sort of stuff, and it'll provision it right into your Amazon VPC if you want to try out the product that way. And finally, we have a support community set up on Cisco.com, and this gives you a way to kind of ask questions either to Cisco or to other users of the CSR in Amazon in a sort of a community fashion through web forums and those sorts of things, or documents that get posted. And it's just the link at the top there, support forums at Cisco.com, community, CSR-Amazon. And if you go there, you can sign up, log in, and probably find a lot of answers to questions that you might have from people who have already asked it, or you can post your own questions there if you wish. So that's pretty much a wrap on all the information that I had for you today in this sort of kickoff webinar. Again, there will be follow-up webinars on more detailed topics if you have any particular interests in different types of deployments or use cases. But I'm going to leave this slide up here for you. I have my contact information. I'm James Schultz, and my colleague Esteban, who's also answering some of the Q&A questions here, his email address is there as well. So feel free to reach out to either of us or both of us if you have any questions about the product, or even if you have an idea for something that you want to do with the product and it can't do today. We're the guys who build the roadmap for the product, so we can help it address your needs. If you have anything particular that you want us to try to get on the roadmap, feel free to give us a shout, and we'd love to have a conversation with you about it.